The wind blew gently over the cherry trees of the temple, scattering pale petals like ashes in the moonlight. The village of Hanamura was preparing for the Festival of the Ancestral Flowers, a sacred event that, for centuries, had marked the beginning of spring and the connection between the living and the dead. In the center of the square, lanterns were lit one by one, casting an amber glow over the dance masks awaiting their maidens. They said that once a year, forgotten spirits came to dance among the living, hidden beneath the veils of the priestesses. But no one spoke of it aloud. It was a legend whispered only by the elders, warning that if someone looked into the wrong eyes during the dance, they might never find their way home again. Takashi, a young potter's apprentice, never believed in such stories. To him, it was all a spectacle of tradition and beauty, a performance to honor the ancestors. But that night, as he walked among the crowds, something made his heart stop. Among the dancers, one woman moved differently from the others. Her kimono flowed like mist over the earth, and the flowers in her crown gleamed with a cold light, as if illuminated from within. Her skin seemed translucent under the moonlight, and her eyes, when she looked at him, Takashi felt a deep shiver. It wasn't fear. It was as if something inside him was being called closer to her. Takashi never considered himself special. He was just a 19-year-old boy, the son of a respected potter, destined to continue the family trade. He spent his days molding clay and his nights watching the fire consume the pieces in the kiln, as if always waiting for something that never arrived. His father, a strict man of few words, believed that tradition and discipline were everything. Takashi was expected to master the art of ceramics, marry a village girl, and carry on the family name. But there was a restlessness inside him, a desire to see beyond the boundaries of Hanamura, to understand what lay beyond the stories told by the fire. And that night, before the woman with luminous flowers, he felt he had finally found something that shattered the monotony of his existence. "Who is she?" he murmured to himself, trying to follow the dancer's steps. The drums pounded in a hypnotic rhythm, and the women twirled around the bonfire. But that figure was different. Her movements seemed slightly out of sync, as if she were dancing in another world. Takashi looked around, expecting to find someone else who had noticed. But no one seemed to see what he saw. The villagers clapped, enchanted, unaware that something was amiss. Then, for a brief moment, the woman's eyes turned to him, fixed, aware. A shiver ran down his spine. She raised her hand delicately, as if reaching for him from afar. And when the sleeves of her kimono billowed, Takashi saw what no one else could. Her arms were far too pale, almost translucent, like ancient porcelain on the verge of cracking. The festival carried on around him, but for Takashi, everything had faded into a distant whisper. Takashi felt his feet move before his mind could decide. As if pulled by an invisible thread, he began to weave through the crowd, following the dancer. She twirled slowly, her movements graceful, and her spectral flowers seemed to pulse in sync with the drums. But then, for a brief moment, her body faltered. The glow of the petals dimmed, and Takashi caught a glimpse of what lay beneath that veil of beauty. Empty eyes. A shadow where a face should have been. His heart pounded. The woman resumed her dance the very next instant as if nothing had happened. But Takashi could no longer look away. "Takashi!" His father's voice cut through the air like the slash of a blade. He turned, seeing the man standing near the ceremonial furnace, where incense burned for the ancestors. His father's gaze was stern, his stance firm. "What are you doing? You shouldn't be distracted by this," the man said, frowning as he noticed where his son had been looking. Takashi hesitated. He wanted to tell him what he had seen, but something held him back, as if speaking the words aloud would give them even more power. "Nothing, father. I was just watching." His father studied him for a long moment before sighing. "The dead must be honored, not followed. If you stare too long into the shadows, they may stare back at you." A shiver ran through Takashi at those words, but his father had already turned away. The music played on, but now he noticed something strange in the melody, a faint sound, almost imperceptible, like a distant song, coming from a place where no one should be singing. The dancer began to move again, gliding away from the square, and before he even realized it, Takashi was following her. The trail of luminous petals on the ground was a silent invitation. To follow meant to cross an invisible threshold, but he had already crossed it the moment his eyes met hers. Takashi followed the dancer without realizing that the sounds of the festival were fading into the distance. The glow of the lanterns was replaced by the darkness of the forest, where only the ghostly petals illuminated the path. The woman moved forward unhurriedly, gliding like mist over the earth, and Takashi noticed that no footprints marked the ground where she passed. His heart pounded. He should turn back. His father had been right, but an invisible force held him in that moment, as if retreat was no longer an option. "Who are you?" His voice sounded weak in the silence of the woods. The woman stopped. Slowly, she turned to him. "You can see me?" Her voice was soft, laced with surprise, and something else, hope. Takashi hesitated. His instincts screamed at him to run, but there was something in her tone that kept him rooted. Who are you?" he repeated. She took a step forward, and then, like a veil being lifted, the truth revealed itself. Her feet did not touch the ground. Her face, beautiful and pale beneath the moonlight, was marred by fine cracks, like those on ancient porcelain. "My name," her eyes shimmered with an infinite sorrow, "no longer matters. I made a mistake, and now I am trapped between two worlds." Takashi felt his throat go dry. "Trapped? Yes. And you—" Her voice faltered, as if speaking something forbidden. "You can set me free." The wind whispered through the trees. Then, suddenly, Takashi noticed something terrifying. The flowers on her head, the ones that glowed with an unreal light, were wilting. The radiance within them flickered, weakening. "Time is running out," she murmured. Takashi didn't understand. But one thing was certain. He was already too entangled in this night to escape unscathed. Takashi felt his breath quicken. The forest around him seemed darker, the shadows heavier. "What do you mean by set you free?" His voice barely came out. The woman lowered her gaze, hesitant. The remaining petals in her crown trembled on the verge of fading. "Long ago, I was one of the maidens chosen for the festival dance," she said, her voice seeming to come from a distant place. "But I broke tradition." She lifted her eyes, and in those ghostly irises, Takashi saw something profoundly human. Guilt. "I loved someone, a man who was not from the village, and on the night of the festival, I ran away with him." A cold wind whispered through the trees. "But we were betrayed. The village elders found us before we could escape. He was killed right there. And I—" She placed a hand over her chest, and for an instant, Takashi saw a dark stain spreading across the fabric of her kimono. "I was thrown into the temple's lake." Takashi held his breath. "You were. I should have followed my fate, honored the spirits. But I chose love, and I was punished." A terrible silence hung between them. Then she reached out her hand. "But you saw me. You can finish what I could not." A chill ran down Takashi's spine. "What does that mean?" She stepped closer. "For me to rest, someone must dance in my place." Takashi's blood turned to ice. "What?" "A life for a life," she whispered. "If I cross to the other side, you will take my place." He stumbled back. His heart pounded. His mind screamed at him to run. But then, he looked into her eyes again. Those were not the eyes of a monster. They were the eyes of someone who only wanted peace. "Time is running out." Her voice wavered. The last flowers in her crown went dark. The silence of the forest shattered with a deafening crack. The ground seemed to collapse beneath Takashi's feet. He had to choose. Now. Takashi's heart pounded in his chest. The weight of the choice was crushing. Dance in her place? Be trapped between worlds as she was? The woman extended her hand once more. She did not beg, nor did she force him. She simply waited. And then, Takashi understood. She did not want to condemn him. She only wanted to know if someone would do for her what no one had done in the past. Time seemed to fold around them. The wind ceased. The forest fell silent. It was now. Takashi took a deep breath and stepped forward. The shadows stirred. The ground beneath his feet glowed, forming a circle of spectral petals. The woman's eyes widened in surprise. "You will..." Takashi closed his eyes and began to dance. His movements were clumsy at first, but soon he found the rhythm, one that seemed to echo from the unseen world around him. The air grew heavy. The petals rose in brilliant spirals. The woman covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes welling with tears. And then she smiled. Slowly, her body began to fade. The cracks in her skin healed. The darkness on her chest disappeared. She was being set free, but something was wrong. Takashi felt his legs weaken. His body grew lighter, as if something was being pulled from him. The forest around him began to distort. He looked down at his own hands. They were becoming translucent. Fear sliced through him like a blade. "Wait!" He tried to stop, but his feet kept moving on their own. It was too late. The woman gazed at him with sorrow, as if she had always known there was no turning back. "Thank you." Her voice drifted like a whisper on the wind, and then she was gone. The forest fell silent. The glow of the flowers faded. Takashi stood still, feeling the weight of emptiness settle around him. He tried to step back, but something held him in place. He no longer belonged to the world of the living. The distant sound of drums echoed from the village. The festival was still happening, but for Takashi, time no longer flowed the same way. Slowly, he turned and saw the trail of glowing petals forming along the path. It was his turn to wait, his turn to be seen. They say that every spring a new dancer appears among the young women at the festival. Her face is never the same, but her flowers glow in a way no one can explain. Some villagers swear that if you look closely enough, you might see someone watching from afar, a young man with a lost gaze, trapped between worlds. But be careful. If you meet his eyes in the crowd, do not follow him, for there is always a spirit waiting to be set free, and always someone new to take their place. If this story kept you reading until the end, share it with someone who would love this mystery. Would you have the courage to meet the wrong eyes during the dance? Comment on what you would have done in Takashi's place. And remember, not every tradition is just a ritual. Some are warnings,